Hey, what's up guys? Welcome back to the channel. In this video, we're going to practice compositing Open EXR files in After Effects. EXR files are the industry standard for rendering and compositing. We're not going to delve too far into why that is right now, but I am going to show you how to set up your project, linearize your workflow, and get started using an EXR sequence. So check the link in the description where you can grab the plate and the renders. There's going to be multiple passes for this. So I'm also going to show you how to composite those specific passes. And we're also going to be using a Z-depth pass in order to composite atmospheric perspective. So what we're going to be creating is this. So I have a clean plate provided as well, so we're going to do our best to match that reference image. Part of being a visual effects artist is being able to match a reference or match lighting in a plate, and this provides pretty good practice for something that's a relatively simple shot. All right, that sounds interesting. Let's get started. All right, so let's start by having a look at this image of a plane landing through fog. So we're going to use this as our plate or our reference plate. What I did, I just painted out the plane to create a clean plate. So we'll be using this as our plate, but then we'll be using the original as a reference to look at black values and look at the materials and reflections and just the overall lighting. So let's begin by making a composition. I'm going to just leave this at full HD. I'm only going to use one frame because I'm just doing a still in this case. And I'm going to take all of these and pull it down. And I'm going to close my footage tab, and now I'm looking at the composition. All right, so before we do anything at all, remember that if you're rendering something from Maya and you rendered out raw images or linear images, you need to make sure your color management is set up properly. So click down here in your project settings. This might say 8, 16, or 32 BPC. If you're using a 32-bit EXR, definitely make sure you're using the full 32-bit float. It's usually safer just to leave this at 32-bit all the time, so you're using the full range of color available to you. All right, so in that case, I'm going to leave that at 32. And now you need to set your working space. Now this is project dependent. However, if you're not really doing anything in particular, you probably just want to set this to your monitor's working space, which is probably going to be sRGB. And then the last thing is you have to click this linearize working space. If you forget to do this and you're nearly done with your project, it's better just to leave this off. Otherwise, you're going to have to redo all your color correction. Right, so just click that. So in order to be able to utilize the correct color management of these EXRs, we need to make sure After Effects is reading them properly. So to do this, we're going to right click on any one of these, but just do it on the first one. Go to Interpret Footage and then click Main. So what you need to do is go to your color management tab. The profile is already set up for sRGB, but then it's this little option right here. So by default, After Effects won't consider an EXR image as linear unless it is a 32-bit EXR. So if these happen to be 16-bit EXRs, what you would need to do is click this and then say on. So basically this is just overriding it to always interpret that file as linear. So when we do this, you might not notice any change. If you do color correction though, you will notice a difference. So after that is selected, go back to the same one and then click Remember Interpretation. And then you can just shift select all the other layers, right click, interpret footage, and then apply interpretation. So now let's have a look at what we have in here. So let's turn all these layers off and just start from the bottom. So we have our clean plate right here, and then we have our plane landing through fog. And then if we turn on our first layer here, it happens to be just the master beauty. If it doesn't have a name in V-Ray, that just indicates it's the beauty shot. And I'm going to take this plane landing through fog reference layer and just move it off to the side here. And I'm going to grab a pen tool, and I'm just going to trace around where that plane is. So we're going to get rid of that edge at the bottom. We don't actually require this beauty pass at all, so we're just going to delete it. And now we need to reorder the passes in the correct order. So let's turn on GI, pull that to the bottom. After GI, we put lighting, and after lighting, we're going to do reflection, specular, and self-illumination. Now all of these 4 layers here, the order doesn't matter because the blending mode is just going to be additive. So we're going to set those to be add. AO is going to be multiplied. And then the last one up here is Z-depth, and Z-depth is just referenced. We're going to use it as a matte. So the point of this demo is to practice using Z-depth, and Z-depth is a really good way to recreate atmospheric perspective in a shot. So what it does is, based on the camera's position in Maya or whatever software you're using, it's going to measure the distance between that and the object. As the object comes closer, it's going to change its value. It's either going to get darker as it comes near the camera, or it's going to get brighter. It doesn't really matter which way that is interpreted. You can always flip the values in After Effects. In this case, as it gets closer, it's going to be darker. So what we need to do on this is to give it a lot more definition to make it look like there's a really thick layer of fog in the background and the ship is just passing through this really thick fog layer. So we're going to grab a curves effect, and I'm going to crush these white values quite a bit, and I'm also going to crush the black values. I'm not going to clip it like this is clipped. We're going to get right to the point where just before it would start clipping, like right there, and then crush the white values just a bit more. So now we can see there's a lot of contrast. So the more contrast on your Z-depth, the thicker the fog is going to look as you composite it. So we're going to then turn this off for now, and we're going to go to the GI layer, and we're going to set a matte. So we're going to use the Z-depth layer as a matte, and traditionally what you would do, you would take this Z-depth layer right above the GI, and you would change the track matte to be a Luma matte. Since we're going to be using the black and white values of this to determine how much of the ship actually shows up, it's basically just going to make it more transparent or less transparent. However, we would need to put a Z-depth matte layer above every single pass, and there's going to be so many copies that it's just going to get a little bit too irritating. So there's an alternative method, which is going to involve a set matte effect. So the set matte effect allows you to use any arbitrary layer as a layer's matte. So we're going to go up to change the matte to be the Z-depth layer, and we have to choose effects and masks. So we need to make sure effects and masks is on, otherwise the curves effect on the Z-depth layer would not be taken into account. So the type of matte would be luminance, since we're looking at the value, and we also need to invert this because we want the lighter values to be in the front, darker values in the back. Otherwise we'll get the wrong result here. So as you can see, it looks lighter the further the ship is away from the camera, and the front part of the ship is a little bit more clear. Now we're going to have to come back and modify this curves later as we start compositing it, but for now this gives us a good indication of what we can expect in terms of the value change. Okay, so go back to the GI layer. I'm going to copy the set matte effect on each one of the passes. So we're going to just Control C and then Control V on all of these passes. Don't put it on the Z-depth layer. It wouldn't make sense for a layer to use itself as a matte. That doesn't make sense. So we're going to turn these on one by one and just see what we have. So the next one is going to be lighting. So GI is global illumination, or all your indirect light, and lighting is simply going to be your direct light. But if you look at the reference image here, it's very cloudy, very foggy. There is no clear direct light source. So by having a direct light source, we're not really matching the plate anymore, and it doesn't make sense to really use this direct lighting. So we're just gonna turn this off, and we might just delete this layer entirely. Next is reflections. If we turn this on, you can barely see any difference if we toggle this back and forth. If we solo this layer, you can barely make out there's some value there. So this just means that in Maya, the reflection quality wasn't quite strong enough. But we can modify this by adding a curves effect on and then just crushing the white values so we actually begin to see what the reflection pass looks like. Unsolo this, and now you can see if we toggle this on and off, now there is a clear reflection pass. If you look at the plane, it's quite reflective, and it is up to us what we choose for reflections here, because the materials of this ship may not be the same as the plane, but I think it requires a little bit more reflections. Alright, so now let's go on to specular. So what a specular reflection is going to be a concentrated amount of energy that's just being reflected off at a specific angle, and based on your viewing angle, you see that. So it's like a highlight, and highlights are visible from any point, but you can only see them in the current position based on your position. So as you move around an object, the highlights will begin to shift. I'm going to pull on a curves effect on this as well and just increase this. So if we crush these values a lot, you'll see it's beginning to look like there's a direct light source from the front. So it's not something we want to do, but we do want to crush these quite a bit just so we can see some variation of light on the ship. And we might go ahead and just lower the gold value of this, because it does look a little bit too warm. I would not usually modify this curves anymore, since we've crushed all the value down to this very thin strip. It's harder to modify at this point. We'll grab another one, and we can just go in and we can just infuse just a little bit more blue. And by pulling the blue channel up a little bit, we're going to kind of get rid of that yellowish glint. With the blue tint, it looks a little bit more natural. All right, so now on to self-illumination. So self-illumination is going to be all the ship lights. I'm going to grab a curves effect, and again, we're going to crush these values as well. So if you look at the reference, these landing lights are extremely bright. So we don't want to match the clipping of the original plate because clipping it tends to indicate this poor color work and it's not very attractive to look at, like a really harsh edge. But we are going to kind of match this glow effect, and that glow is caused by particles in the air near the light being illuminated. So we're going to grab a glow effect. So the glow can come underneath the curves. So right away you can see it kind of looks hideous, but if we go to the glow radius, just increase that, we can lower this curves until it looks a little bit more natural, something more like this. And if you wanted to mess around with the threshold basically means the point at which a bright value will start to glow. So the lower the threshold, values don't have to be quite as bright to start glowing. And as you increase it, you get to the point where barely any values are bright enough to start glowing. So it's up to you. Okay, so that looks a little bit better in terms of the glow and the brightness, although we need a little bit more hotness in the center. But before we do that, I want to change the color. So let's add a hue and saturation effect, pull this underneath the glow, and let's just desaturate this about 30 to 40%. If there's fog between the viewer and the subject, and that subject is far away, the lights are not going to look as saturated, especially if there's a lot of fog. So by doing this, it looks a little bit more natural. And then after I do that, I can add another curves effect. And with this curves effect, if we just crush the white values a little bit, we can make it pop just a little bit more. Makes it look a little closer to the reference. And I think it looks quite good here. One last thing. If we wanted to make this reddish glow slightly more of a yellowish or goldish tint, more like this, if you go back up to your hue and saturation wheel, you can just rotate this very slightly, maybe just between 5 and 10 degrees, and you can kind of make the colors just shift just a little bit. I think this looks a little bit nicer, matches the reference a little bit closer, and it makes these greenish lights a little bit more blue. Another tendency is for lights to go a little bit more blue shifted the further away they are or any type of color, and this kind of helps a little with that. Okay, so next is going to be AO. So let's turn AO on. And remember that the point of AO is to capture fine shadow information that usually gets lost in most GI or direct illumination renders. If we look at the reference here, we can't really tell any need for fine shadow information. So by using AO, we're kind of making this look a little fake. So what we want to do is go to our AO and either not use it at all, or just turn the opacity like all the way down between 5 and 10%. And at 10%, we can kind of make out just a little bit of definition around the engines. So we toggle this on and off. I think it helps very slightly, makes it look like there is something there. But again, you could just completely ignore AO and everything would be fine. Okay, so next what we need to do is we need to create a matte for the ship and use an adjustment layer to control the overall values of the ship so we can start to match the black values of the plane. So to do that, I'm just going to grab any arbitrary layer here because all of these passes include an alpha channel of the ship. We can duplicate our GI, for example, pull this above our AO, and then we should rename the layer. So I'm going to solo this layer now. We don't need the set matte effect on it anymore, so we can delete that. And the next thing is that we want to differentiate this from the GI layer. So I'm going to add a fill effect and just leave it on the standard fill. It's red, it doesn't matter what color it is. And this step is not required, but if you were to turn your layer name back to source name, you will see that this says the original name of that layer. So it's going to say, hey, it's the GI layer. And if the GI layer, it says GI layer and it looks like the GI layer, you might get confused a little later, or if you ever hand the project off to someone else and it's a little bit unclear, it makes it a little bit easier if this is filled in, so it clearly looks like a matte. Again, you don't have to do this, just a little tip. So now I can turn this layer off. Underneath that layer, I can add an adjustment layer. This adjustment layer will be the ship color correction. And then we're going to set the track matte to be alpha. Alright, so then on the ship CC layer, we're going to grab a curves effect and pull this over. Now for this next part, we need to go to our info tab and we need to zoom in on our reference, and we're trying to find the darkest black value of our reference. So the darkest values are probably going to be in the engine somewhere where it's very, very shadowed. And as you can see, these values are actually quite bright. We're looking at 0.006, 0.009, around there. Maybe something back here is slightly darker. Maybe 0.005, that's about as dark as I can see. But if we look at ours goes very, very dark. We're looking at like 0.01. So the idea is if there is a layer of fog, all black values need to be lifted slightly. and they need to be lifted to the point at which they match objects in the plate at the same distance. So we're gonna take our curves, we're gonna zoom in, just magnify the curves, and then we're gonna pull this up. And this is very sensitive, so you have to be a little careful with this. And at this point, you can just compare the values. We're looking at 0.05 here. This is more like 0.06, so we can pull this up just a little bit more. So that seems to match slightly better. We're looking a little bit too bright at the bottom, but we can fix that in a moment. We could also, with our curves, if we zoom back out, we could pull some of the midtones back down. So doing something like this is going to darken the bottom more just by pulling those midtones to be slightly darker. Another thing you'll notice is the color of the ship. It doesn't really match the color here. This is very bluish, and we have quite a bit of a greenish yellow tint on ours. So we're going to grab another curves effect. I usually like to separate curves between contrast and color. So we're going to go to our blue channel, and we're just going to pull in just a little bit of blue. That's going to just help it just a little bit more. Another thing that we can do, we can notice that the underneath part here has quite a bit of color that's still showing up. We don't see any color here. There might not be any color, but I think this is too saturated. So we need to go find the layer that's on. So if I go to my GI layer, turn that on, you can see that that color is visible there. If I look at any other layer, there's nothing on reflection, nothing on specular, nothing on self-illumination, so it's just our GI layer. So with the GI layer selected, we could add a curves if we wanted to darken this even more at the bottom. Doing that makes it a little bit more desaturated. Also helps the shadows look a little darker overall at the bottom. And we could then add a hue and saturation effect. So with hue and saturation, we can just pull down the saturation, maybe even to around -40, -50, somewhere around there. Okay, so if we zoom out now, we can see that this is beginning to look a little bit more like our plate. All right, so I'm going to go back to our ship CC layer, and I'm just going to add or pull out just a tad of the red values, very slightly. And then we're looking a little greenish, so I'm going to go to the green channel and also pull out just a tad more green. I think that looks a little bit more natural now. Okay, so the next thing is we need to kind of match the defocus blur that we see on this plane. It's not very sharp. A lot of it has to do with the compression of the video file, but if we want to match this plate, we need to match those type of effects as well. So remember, the point of visual effects is to always match the camera. So we want it to make it look like it was shot on the same camera. So we're going to grab a null object. And remember, a null object just acts as a utility layer. And I need to pull this above the ship mat here, otherwise we get some confusion on the color correction. We're going to call this defocus control. So on the defocus control, we're going to grab a camera lens blur. And we're going to click on the effect name and then click enter, and then type in master. So this is going to be our control layer, and then we're going to have a copy of this, like a child version of this that's attached to blur radius. And when we come to our master control, we can simply change the value here, and then it will adjust on all the other layers. Grab our ship mat and then put a camera lens blur effect on this as well. Select that layer, click E to open up your effects controls, open up the camera lens blur effect, and do the same thing on defocus control. So click E, and then open up this as well. So the way this works, we're going to alt click on the blur radius. So this is going to set an expression, and then we're going to use the pick whip and attach the pick whip to the blur radius on our master camera lens blur control. So we're then going to release. You'll see a code being generated. You can click the numpad enter key or just click off to the side somewhere. And now when we change this value, let's say to 2, this value also changes to 2. So now what we can do, click on our ship mat, grab this camera lens blur, copy it, and then we can paste this on all the other layers. We're not going to paste it on the ship CC, but we're going to paste it on all our passes. All right, so now this is looking a little bit too defocused, I think. So let's go back up to our defocus control. So let's change this value to 1.5. That looks a little bit closer. All right, so we're nearly done here, at least for our first pass of the composite of this. So we can go to our ship CC layer, and then we can add a little bit of grain. So the effect is called match grain, and match grain needs to go all the way at the very bottom here. All right, so with the match grain, we're gonna change our viewing mode to be final output. And you have to do this with any type of grain. And it says, what layer are we matching? So let's match the plane landing through fog. And when you do that, if you zoom into the shadowed areas, you can kind of see there's a little bit more grain there, but it's not enough. Let's open up tweaking. We can increase the intensity to perhaps 2. Now it looks a little bit more natural. So I think that looks pretty good here. Makes it look a little bit more integrated. We can't really match this distortion very easily. Unless you're trying to match something that's shot on a phone, you probably would never run into this issue. A client is unlikely to give you a plate that's this compressed. Zoom out, fit up to 100. There are still things that we can do. We could go back in, perhaps add a little bit to the midtones of this ship since we have darkened it down too much, I think. I can pull this back up. I think that's going to help just a little bit, perhaps in the highlights. Do something more like this. Now our ship is much darker than the plane, so you have to keep in mind that bit of information. And if you wanted to at this point, if you wanted to add that direct lighting layer back in, doing so now doesn't look as though there is a direct light source anymore, so we could leave that back in. But again, I did say you didn't need it, and I don't think that it is required. The very last thing is though, I want to add just a little bit more contrast to our reflection pass, just a little bit, make it a little bit brighter. And then it's just a case of fine tuning your Z depth. So on your Z depth, the more that you add in terms of the brightness values is going to make it look like there's thicker fog. You could reduce the fog if you wanted to by pulling in this value here, not crushing the whites quite as much. Just add a little bit more of a curve here. But yeah, I think this is pretty good. Okay, so there's one final step, and that's because if we take our plane through fog layer and we move it behind the ship, you will notice that because we are using a Z-depth layer to control the opacity, all that it's doing is it's making the ship just more transparent. So this could potentially be a problem if you're using a plate that the ship goes like over a tree line or some buildings and you would see something in the background pop through the ship, or even if there's a cloud or something like that. Let's move this back. It's not really a problem for us because this is gray, but here's how you would fix the problem. So we could grab a ship mat, duplicate that, pull it underneath our GI, and just rename this to be like ship sky mat. I'm gonna turn this layer on. And then instead of using a red color, we can simply sample the color of the sky there. So there's no real discernible difference now between the values, but if we were to grab this plane landing through fog, move it right behind, now it doesn't show up through it. All right, so that wraps up what I was going to show you for this. This will give you a pretty good first pass of a composite of a ship coming in to land through fog. All right guys, thank you so much for watching. I hope this provided some useful insight in how to get started compositing in After Effects from Maya and V-Ray. This also would apply to other type of render engines and other software, so the type of passes that you'll get from different renders might differ slightly, but the way you composite them is going to be more or less the same. There's going to be some nuanced differences, and I think in subsequent videos what we'll do is use different types of passes and also multi-channeled EXRs. So one of the primary benefits of an EXR is that you can store all the passes in one file instead of having multiple files. But for this, I thought it was going to be easier just to have separate files, one for each pass. Anyway, thank you so much for watching. If you learned something, drop a like. If you have any questions, post a comment, and I'll be back next week with another video. Peace.